We're going to get started now. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our program with Ray McGovern. I'm really excited for tonight's program. It's a really great turnout. We had over 400 people registered for the Zoom meeting, and we're live streaming on different social media platforms. So I want to take a moment to thank Marty Schatz. I want to thank Dean Stevens, and I want to thank Cole Harrison. I want to thank the No Cold War Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. I want to thank all of Massachusetts Peace Action and all of Community Church of Boston. Thank you for sponsoring this program tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining us. And a special thank you to Ray McGovern for being here with us tonight. Ray is going to give us a talk. And so that's the format of tonight's event. We're going to hear a talk from Ray, and then we're going to get into a Q&A. So Ray's talk tonight, it's not going to be just a situation report. Rather, he's going to don his old hat as presidential briefer and will draw on old school media analysis and the expertise of weapons experts to examine one key motive behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After the U.S. withdrew from the ABM Treaty, missile hopes started to appear in NATO allies Romania and Poland. The problem: the Kremlin cannot be sure what missiles now dwell or could dwell eventually in these holes, nor could Moscow abide by the possibility of similar holes being dug even closer to Russia and Ukraine. 60 years ago, President Kennedy faced a similar situation in Cuba. So that's what Ray McGovern's talk is going to be about. Ray McGovern was formerly an Army intelligence and infantry officer, and he went on to serve at the CIA for 27 years. During this time, his duties included sharing the national intelligence estimates and preparing the president's daily brief, which he briefed to President Ronald Reagan's most senior national security advisors. In 2003, Ray co-created Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity to expose how intelligence was being falsified to justify the war on Iraq. After his retirement, the CIA awarded Ray McGovern with the Intelligence Commendation Medallion for, quote, especially meritorious service. In 2006, Ray returned the medal, explaining, I do not want to be associated, however, remotely with an agency engaged in torture. Along with being fluent in English, Ray is also fluent in Russian and German and Spanish. Ray, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amar, and thank you all for tuning in. I hope you'll pardon this cold that I have, and I hope I'll be able to get through this without coughing too much. Amar, can we have the first slide, please? I gave this a curious title. If the shoe fits, wear it. If the missile fits, beware. You should get an idea of what I'm talking about as we go along. But let me start by saying that when I donned my old hat as a representative of the Director of Central Intelligence, this involved my having access to the very best specialists, whether they were from NSA or they from the Pentagon. I had my tasking at one point. It was Western Europe as well as the Soviet Union. And I could pick on these people and draw on their expertise, learn from them, and then tell it like it was. Now, one recent example, just to set the stage here, is a fellow named Bill Binney, who was by and large the smartest guy ever worked at NSA. Even his old colleagues that don't abide by his opposition to a lot of what NSA does agree on that. I was able to turn to Bill Binney in our Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity group to tell me, what about this Russian hacking bill? For God's sake, all kinds of circumstantial evidence is being adduced by the New York Times and by the intelligence community, but there's no evidence, for God's sake. Tell me about this. So that's what Bill did. He picked some slides made luckily available from Ed Snowden, slide showing how NSA would have intercepted anything that was a hack from the DNC computers. And his conclusion, I actually printed out here, he says, the bottom line is that NSA would know where and how any hacked emails from the DNC, from Hillary Clinton, or any other servers were routed through the network. They don't know that. And thereon hangs a tale. The date of that memo that we wrote as VIPS was December 12th, 2016. So Trump hadn't even become president yet. He was president-elect. Now, less than 1 year later, the head of the computer firm that was to look into the DNC hacks, really leaks, testified under oath to Congress saying there is no evidence that Russia or anyone else hacked the DNC emails. There is no exfiltration that we looked after our comprehensive and thorough look. So it wasn't a hack by Russia or anybody else. That was December 5th, I repeat, 2017. Huh. Raise your hand if you know about that. Oh, I don't see many hands going up there. Why? The New York Times has suppressed that story from December 5th, 2017 through today. What's today? April 25th, 2023. So all I'm saying here is that very crucial judgments could be made if someone takes the trouble to combine various sources, including open source material, with the experts who know which end is up and who will tell the truth without fear or favor. Maybe I'll let it go at that and simply add that in this case, Ted Postal, whom some of you know, was my technical expert, okay? There is no one who knows more about this issue than Ted Postal. Matter of fact, he's published on it and he's been shunned about some of his conclusions having to do with how the US violated the INF Treaty, the Treaty on Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the one that banned a whole class of missiles and their launchers, had them destroyed. And Scott Ritter, my good friend, was one of the people who inspected that destruction. So Ted Postal has given me some sexy slides. The first one you'll see are kind of pedantic. They're sort of like not very sexy, but it's the political analysis that I used to do based on media analysis, which is really just a subdiscipline of political science. Okay, you look at what leaders say and you try to glean interesting information from those. So what I saw Mr. Putin saying, and actually I was in Russia at the time he said these first remarks to Western journalists, was really intriguing. I have 3 slides, which I will read through very quickly for those who maybe later have podcast earplugs or whatever. And we'll go through that, and then I'll tell you what I thought about that. Will we have the next slide, Emma, please? Okay. So there was a captive audience. These reporters were up there for an economic summit, and Putin said, look, you come here. I'm going to give you the straight scoop on this very, very important subject, crucial subject. I don't expect you to publish on it. I don't even expect you to tell your editorial staff about it, but I want to talk to you human being to human being. And this is some of what he said. The US, has placed their missile defense system, in quotes, in Romania, saying that we must protect ourselves from the Iranian nuclear threat. Now, just as an aside, I asked Ted Postal, could you do a map of Europe and Poland and Romania and Iran? He said, why? I said, well, you know, a lot of Americans, they thought Ukraine was in the middle of the Pacific. So he says, look, you'd be insulting people. Everyone knows that Iran is far and out of range. So there's no map of Iran in correlation with Poland or Romania. Here's what Putin is saying. There is no Iranian nuclear threat, especially after that 5-power agreement was reached, but the missile systems are continuing to be deployed. We're talking about Romania. This is 2016. So they built the system, and now it's being loaded with missiles. Next slide, please. These missiles are put in capsules, containers, used for sea-based mid-range Tomahawk rocket launchers, which are offensive missiles. Now, one could put them into position in Romania, for example, in a matter of hours. And then what kind of system, what kind of anti-missile system are we talking about? More important, how do we know what kind of missiles in there? All you have to do is change the program. That's all it would take. Next slide, please. Finishing up on what Putin told these Western reporters, this could happen. That is, changing the program could happen very quickly, and even the Romanian government itself wouldn't know what's going on. Do you think they would let the Romanians call the shots? Nobody is going to know what's being done. Not the Romanians, not the Poles. The Poles were slated for this kind of installation as well. The Poles won't either. He doesn't say this, but neither will we. Neither will we, Russian planners, Russian military, me as president of Russia. We won't know what's being done. Okay. So he finishes up by saying, well, from what I could see, we are in grave danger. Now, I came by that transcript just luckily because I was plugged in with some people who not only get a hold of it, but put subtitles under it. I may have used this in one of my previous talks here. In any case, it's available on the web, and I'll give you the URL for it later. May we have the next slide, please? So we fast forward now. That was 2016. Here's December 21st, 2021. Okay, the balloon is about to go up. Soviet forces, Russian forces are near Ukraine. And so Putin makes this formal address to it was the State of the Military address, okay? And what he says to them, he looks at these generals and admirals and Defense Minister Shoigu, and he says, this is extremely alarming. Mk-41 launchers, the correct designation, is already in Romania, and soon they'll be in Poland. The deadline for Poland was the end of last year. There's some talk about some delay there, but it looks like they're fully ready to put them in Poland as well. So here's Putin again. These Mk launchers can launch offensive strike missiles. Note the date here, December 21st. He goes on, if US missiles are deployed in Ukraine, their flight time to Moscow will be about 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes if we're talking about hypersonic systems. Again, this is a huge challenge for us, for our security. Okay, now, after he made his formal remarks, Shoigu, the defense minister, the others got up and talked, and then he said, I want to say some more words. So you don't deprive the president of your country of the microphone. Next slide, please. I'd like to have a few words. Okay. He goes into what he deems the illegality of what the US did in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, and Syria. And then he makes a distinction. He says, what the US is doing now in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometers away. It is on our doorstep. We simply have nowhere to retreat. He's telling his leading generals and admirals this on the 21st of December. The US does not have hypersonic weapons yet, but we know, and we will know, when they have them. Они знают, что мы знаем. They know that we know, okay? They will supply hypersonic weapons to Ukraine. Putin's words on the 21st of December. Okay, next slide, please. Next thing you know, the Kremlin calls the White House and says, Mr. Putin would like to talk to Mr. Biden like right away. White House was flummoxed. Look, we're going to get together in Geneva, our representatives. We're going to start talking about these important. Why now? Please, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden right now. Now, to his credit, Biden accepts the call on the 30th of December. And what's the outcome? Well, it's confirmed that the negotiations would take place in Geneva, January 9 and 10. And also, and this is important to Putin, that the presidents themselves would personally supervise the negotiating tracks. That's important because he's had bad experience with presidents of the United States when ceasefires go up in smoke at the hands of the U.S. Air Force. Now, here we have the key. In this context, President Biden emphasized that Russia and the U.S. share a special responsibility for ensuring stability in Europe, and that Washington has no intention of deploying offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. Whoa. So, December 21st, Putin says when they get hypersonic missiles, they're going to deploy them in Ukraine. This is a real threat to us. On the 30th, Biden tells him, Washington has no, this is a quote from the readout, Washington has no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Whoa, next slide, please. What was the reaction on the Russian side? Whoa, Ushakov, Yuri Ushakov, who's the main aide to Putin on these matters. He says, well, we're really pleased. He emphasizes that Biden's pledge not to deploy offensive arms in Ukraine amounted to an acknowledgement of Russian security concerns. Wow, this is something that the Russians were lusting after, right? Acknowledgement that they have security concerns here. Ushakov stressed that this was one of the goals that Moscow hopes to achieve with the proposal it had just made, the proposals for security guarantees from the US and from NATO. Those draft treaties that were given to the US and NATO just a week or two before. Well, actually, if you look at it and you read the text of those draft treaties, Ushakov is understating the case. Well, I'll just read this. The U.S. non-deployment of offensive missiles in Ukraine, that kind of assurance addresses a key issue embedded in no fewer than 5 of the 8 articles in the Russian draft treaty on security guarantees. So you got more than half of the main issues listed in the draft treaty addressed by this one thing here, which seems to have happened all of a sudden, right? Biden made this assurance, and it was just 9 days after Putin was telling, or 10 days after Putin was telling his folks, this is a real problem. Whoa. So no wonder Ushakov is upbeat. Okay, next slide, please. Downbeat. February 12th. What's that, about 6 weeks later? 2022 now. Ushakov briefs the media on Biden, Putin's most recent, actually it may be their very last telephone call or tete-a-tete virtual. So this is a quote from Ushakov. The Putin-Biden telephone talk today followed up on that, on the one from December 30th. Okay, so it's a follow-up. I want to note straight away that Putin made clear that Biden did not really address the central key elements of Russia's initiatives, either with regard to non-expansion of NATO or non-deployment of strike weapons systems on Ukrainian territory. So something fell in the cracks. One can speculate that when Biden woke up on New Year's Eve, Jacob Sullivan and Blinken were there, and I said, Joe, Mr. President, you didn't really say that to Putin, did you? Well, yeah, I thought we'd get the negotiations off to a good stuff. Forget about it. Well, I don't know if that's the way it happened, but the U.S. side forgot about it. Okay, so this is February 12th now, 2002, 2022. Now we know that that's just what 10 days before, 2 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. Am I saying this is the only reason? Of course not. Am I saying it's a contributing factor? I am saying that, partly because of the lack of trust that Mr. Putin perceived in this promise, this maybe not promise, maybe it was an assurance. NATO, Washington has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. We have the next slide, please. Now, I promised you more sexy slides, right? And I told you that Ted Postal worked with me. Actually, we spent several evenings discussing all this, me asking him questions, just like I asked Bill Binney, what about this or what about that? Ted is a terrific guy. He was really, really helpful. He constructed this map. I said, Ted, take a generic ballistic missile, okay? And would you show where the site in Romania is and where the site in Poland is, and give us an idea, launch to target. I mean, is Putin blowing smoke, or does he have actual reason to be concerned? Okay, well, you can read for yourself. The one from near Kiev, it's about 7 minutes time to target. The one from Romania and from Poland are longer, but it's a real distance. It's a real thing. Okay, may we have the next slide, please? Okay, now the problem is that no, this is not a Lego thing that I gave my grandson for Christmas. Now, this is more serious, okay? This is a canister. What's the big deal here? This is a canister being loaded on a destroyer, okay? And you'll see later in the next slide what happens. This canister can accommodate all manner of missiles, cruise missiles, as well as anti-aircraft missiles, as well as anti-submarine missiles, okay? You can't tell from the outside what's in that canister. Here they are loading it or unloading it. We were not really quite sure on one of these cruise missile, one of these Aegis type destroyers. Maybe we have the next slide, please. Okay, just to show you about these canisters. Okay, they can accommodate a Tomahawk cruise missile. That's the one on the left. And they can accommodate all these other things to the right. I'm not going to go through the others. The idea is that what the Russian word is container, these containers can contain any variety of these missiles, and you don't know from looking at the top which ones are in there. Next slide, please. Okay, now here they are. Looks like they're inserting it into one of those things on ship holes. Okay, now I don't know about you, but I'm sort of an old guy, and I have this pillbox, and don't those things look a little bit like pillbox, so you don't take too many pills one day and then not so many the next? Well, that's what it looks like. And when I talked to Ted about this, I said, Ted, can't they get that thing in there easy enough? I mean, why do they have that guy in the middle with the red hat? Why do you have to download the instructions, for God's sake, from Google? And then that woman in the yellow hat, I think it looks like she's doing a little Tai Chi or something to spirit the thing down into the hole. He said, Ray, don't say any of this stuff. This is serious stuff. So I'm not going to say any of that, okay? This is how they load it in or they pull it out. Again, that canister can accommodate all manner of different kinds of missiles, Aegis missiles, AAA missiles, the gamut. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is the way they are deployed on a ship. This is a destroyer, okay? Now you have many of them in the back, what, 4? And you have 2 in the front. That's the way they are on a ship. You'll see later from a model how they look in Romania. Next slide, please. So there's Romania. This is a mock-up. I was in error when I said there are holes in Romania. It's above ground. It's above board. They're on concrete slabs, as Ted told me. And as you can see, that canister, there are 24 missiles that can be launched from that one launch, and it can be expanded to hundreds, okay? Now, that's a vertical launcher enclosure. It's exactly the same kind of thing that's on the ship, except it's now on land. Can you determine what's in those canisters? No. And therein lies a problem for those who really need to know what kind of missile is in that canister. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, here's sort of a combination. There's that picture that I showed you before with the lady. Now, they're trying to load that into one of those capsules on ship. And that's how the Tomahawk launch looks, and how air interceptor, the surface to air missile looks when it's fired. And I have to tell you that after Ted briefed me on all this, next time I looked at my pillbox, I pulled up one of those things really, really carefully. He told me not to say that either. Okay, next slide, please. Well, as you can imagine, and you can see this from Putin's briefing of these Western correspondents in 2016, the Russians are really upset about all this. You know, it defied lots of stuff, and you know, it really, in their view, was a clear violation of the INF Treaty, in which we still existed. Donald Trump not leaving that one until 2019. So here are the Russians complaining. You know, what about all this? So this could be Tomahawks. These are offensive missiles. What's going on in there? Now the State Department reply was, no, can't be Tomahawks, can't be offensive missiles. Why? Because the system lacks the software, fire control hardware, support equipment, other infrastructure needed to launch an offensive ballistic missile or cruise missile such as the Tomahawk. BS. Rubbish. Ted Postal tells me that Putin was right on this. All you need is you don't even need a DVD. A CD will do it, or a thumb drive to stick in that computer and change the program. So when Putin says the program can be changed, he happens to be right on this. These were very desultory, almost offensive answers to Russia's concerns. Ted gave me a very elaborate graphic to show how all this is done, these 3 things that could be easily done overnight. And but I won't bore you with that. I was a little busy. We have the next one, please. Okay, now we have heard that Putin might be legitimately concerned because, well, let's just say that the Russians overthrew the government in Mexico City, let's say. Okay. And then they got that government to request the Russians to put in intermediate or medium range ballistic missiles in Mexico. Uh, that's a hypothetical, but how would the U.S. react? Well, guess what, guys? You don't have to be hypothetical. This happened. It happened in 1962, 60 years ago plus. Now, I happen to be reporting for active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, as an Army infantry intelligence officer to take training and train on some of these weapons. Okay, guess what? There were no weapons at Fort Benning, the Army Infantry Training Center. Now, McGovern naively asked, where are the weapons? And I was told, they're all in Key West, Florida. They have been there for several weeks. Looks like they're ready to go into Cuba, although right now, we're talking November 3rd. Right now, it seems that the tensions have died down. Okay, I'm just saying that because that was what I experienced personally. If I were a year ahead, I would probably have been down there in Key West with my colleagues in the Army. Okay. Now, so what I'm saying here is that when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and those of you who are a little bit younger than me, which include probably a lot of you, might remember that Khrushchev got this idea, hey, Fidel Castro wants me to put these ballistic missiles in Cuba to defend them so the U.S. won't try to overthrow his government anymore like they did before. And that would give us a really leg up. I mean, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Let's try it. It's a gamble, but let's try it, okay? Now, long story short, all manner of medium-range ballistic missiles showed up in Cuba, and because of cloud cover and some other considerations, we didn't find out about them till they were there. We didn't find out about them until they were emplaced. We didn't find out about them until they were armed. Okay? Now, John Kennedy saw this as an existential threat. I mean, hello. Take a look at those circles there. The one in the middle designates how far an IL-28, the Soviet bomber with nuclear weapons, could reach. The next one, which is the operative one, shows an SS-4 range. SS-4 is a medium-range nuclear missile. Now, were they dangerous? Were they highly explosive? Well, you remember that the atom bomb over Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, right? Well, the warheads on these SS-4s were megatons, meaning 1 million tons of TNT. How many were there? I didn't want to make any mistakes on this, so I made a note. 24. 3 regiments, 2 sites, 4 launchers per site. Were they armed? We didn't know for sure, but I have just uncovered a memorandum from Ray Klein, who was the deputy director for intelligence of the CIA at the time, and for whom I later worked when he was in Germany. He warned the president, look, we have to assume that 8 of those missiles can be fired right now. And we also have to assume that they will be armed with nuclear warheads. Why? It just doesn't make any sense to shoot them off, to fire them, unless they have nuclear warheads. Whoa, that was about 5 days into the crisis, October 20th. Worse still, intermediate range ballistic missiles, that's the big circle. That includes San Francisco, Los Angeles, lots of other places, Omaha, where our Strategic Arms Command was, they were also on their way. How do we know that? U-2 photography from October 15th showed emplacements being readied for intermediate range ballistic missiles. Take a look at that map, folks, and see. They're called SS5s, right? Up there on the top is the label. That's the arc, and that's how much they could cover. Guess what? They didn't make it through. If you look at the little box in the lower left corner, you'll see a depiction of the blockade. Okay. Blockade? Isn't that illegal under international law? Oh, yeah, but hey, Kennedy was provoked, right? Okay. So there's the blockade. And as luck would have it, he put the blockade, he called it a quarantine. Okay. Sounds a little nicer, right? So he put the blockade, the quarantine in place just before those intermediate range ballistic missiles got to where the blockade was. So they were deterred. They never reached Cuba. But Kennedy, of course, insisted that all the things be taken back to Russia. He didn't want this existential threat right on our periphery. Now, I don't remember anybody saying in those days, now, wait a second. International law allows any country to pick its own alliances. So Cuba has every right to have Russia introduce intermediate range and medium range ballistic missiles, doesn't it? I mean, Cuba, nobody seemed to make that argument about that, about any country having the right to do whatever it wants when it threatens the existence of a major power. That's a little diversion here, but you're getting my drift, right? So what happened? Well, Kennedy had some really good advisors, okay? He insisted that Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, who had been ambassador to Moscow a couple of months previous, he said, Tommy, you sit in on every one of those key meetings and be a voice for reason, which he was. The Joint Chiefs were going AP on the Hershey Highway, as we would say in the Bronx. I mean, they were really a problem for Kennedy. Llewellyn Thompson helped and Bobby Kennedy helped. They worked out a deal. Now, there was communication in those days, teletype, but it worked, right? Jack Matlock, my friend, was on the other end of the teletype in Moscow. Okay, pretty exciting times. What else? Well, Kennedy made sure that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were never left alone. In other words, he knew what they wanted to do. Curtis LeMay and those guys, this is our chance to get the Russians, for God's sake. We're gonna fritter away this chance. In any case, what I'm saying now is there was communication with the Russians. There were people who had their heads screwed on, right? Think of, comparisons are invidious, but compare Llewellyn Thompson or George Kennan with the likes of Michael McFaul. I won't say anything more. Comparisons really can be rather invidious. The point I'm trying to make here is that we don't have to go to hypothetical situations about, suppose the Russians overthrew the government in Mexico City and we have to do that. This all happened before. What's different? Well, two things very, very different. One, no communication this time around. And two, you have the likes of Michael McFaul advising people like Jacob Sullivan and Tony Blinken. My God, no wonder they're going off half-cocked. Now, I'd like to show you one more photo. Could we have the next one, Amar? This is another difference, okay? Now, this is not a really good photo. It's a YouTube photo. It was very, very helpful back during Cuba. Why? Well, because we had thousands of photos of what SS-4 ballistic missile sites look like. You have a missile erector, you have all those things, a shelter and so forth. So there was what we call an imagery analysis. We call a signature, right? This was like, hey, we are SS4s. So the only real doubt was whether they were armed. I told you about how the intelligence community came down on that. We learned later, decades later, that indeed they were armed. It was safe to assume they were armed. We damn well did well in assuming they were armed because they were, some of them. Ray Klein said 8. 8 can do a lot of damage. 8 times 1 megaton. Anyhow, one reason for me showing this photo is that we know what's there. We know what we were contending with. Okay, think back to those pillboxes, those capsules or those canisters. We don't know what's in those. Now, am I saying that this signature was an argument for stability because we know what we were contending with? I am saying that, and I'm saying that if the Russian military are looking at these canisters in Romania, and they're probably now already installed in Poland, they don't know what's in those canisters, okay? Those canisters, as I tried to prove, can accommodate all manner of missiles, including, remember, offensive strike missiles. So just to finish the little chronology here, well, I won't go over the chronology. I think it was clear enough. December 21st, December 30th, and the next summit and all that kind of thing. Maybe I've gone on long enough here. Maybe what we ought to do is just finish up. And I want to show you 2 more slides. May we have the next one, Amar? Okay. Here's Dan Ellsberg. He talks a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis in his terrific book. If you haven't read The Doomsday Machine, you need to. It is, in my view, the most important book out there these days. Well, it's out there 15 years or so now. It needs to be read. So what Dan says there is, as I saw it, I presume Khrushchev saw it this way. He was just as outgunned in strategic nuclear forces as he was, obviously, in conventional terms in the Caribbean. The Caribbean, okay. Well, think the Black Sea. Do the comparison. Khrushchev's long private telegram, says Dan Ellsberg, told me that he understood, and Khrushchev had his feet on the ground. He knew when a gamble had failed. He didn't want to unleash destruction. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Sorry, Fidel, we're pulling them out. We know international law requires that we do what you asked us to do, but you have every right to ask us, but we're pulling them out, okay? Next slide, please. Okay, here I'm going back to Obama, who I think was president when Joe Biden was vice president. And he famously said, the real axiom is, please don't do stupid stuff, okay? Used another word. Now, what he said on Ukraine is pretty telling. In 2016, he warned, look, Ukraine is a core interest for Moscow in a way that it is not a core interest for the United States. Core interest. That's the word that the Russians are using now for Ukraine, and the Chinese are using now for Ukraine and Taiwan. And thereon hangs another and even more important story. He added, that is Obama, we have to be really clear about what our core interests are and what we're willing to go to war for. Oh, sensible, huh? Okay. Obama resisted sending arms to Ukraine because you know what he said? He said, this would encourage the Ukrainians to think that they could actually defeat the far more powerful Russians. Huh. And he asked his aides, what if we send in equipment and arms and stuff and it ends up in the hands of thugs? Gosh. What I'm saying here is that there can be reasonable approaches to these things on the part of Khrushchev, who backed down as Dan Ellsberg was sure he was going to. Who's going to back down this time? Does Putin view these missiles and other threats having to do with Ukraine as an existential threat or as a core interest? I think he does. Does the Biden administration consider Ukraine a core interest, an existential threat? Well, from a political point of view, I suppose, but from a strategic point of view, I don't think so. And so, what's the bottom line here? I think people like Massachusetts Peace Action, we have to be informed about such things. Please, don't anybody think that I'm saying this is the only reason that Putin decided to attack Ukraine. There are at least two other main reasons I'll mention in passing. One was the fact that the Ukrainian forces trained up to NATO standards with NATO weaponry were about to descend on the Donbass, and that's clear now. And the other, even more important factor was that Putin, contrary to all expectations, got Xi Jinping's buy-off on this, got his nihil obstat. He explained to him on the 4th of February, this is what I'm going to have to do, given the circumstances. And Xi reversed centuries of declaratory Chinese policy. Westphalia, Westphalia, Westphalia. No, voters are inviolate, He said, we'll make a special exception here. We'll give you a waiver on Westphalia. That's what happened. That's the biggest thing that happened, and it's gotten even closer now. So when we talk to people like we're talking now here, Massachusetts Peace Action, let's kind of remember that once we know more about what the situation is, that peace is, at least in the biblical sense, simply the presence of justice. And justice has to be fought for sometimes and sacrificed for. And so if peace action is equally, if both words are of equal merit or equal emphasis, we need to do action at this point. We're coming to a denouement. I don't know what the adolescents who are advising President Biden will encourage him to do once things get even worse in Ukraine. But we have to do everything we can to make sure that we raise our voice and maybe put our bodies into it to prevent the worst from happening. And I hope that you all will go ahead and do that. Thanks very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray, for that talk, for that presentation, for showing us Russia's legitimate security concerns in regards to these missiles and for visualizing the missiles, and also for demonstrating the hypocrisy in U.S. policy. Like, for example, when the Soviet Union had missiles in Cuba, we can break international law and blockade, quarantine Cuba. But when the U.S. does similar things to Russia, they're not supposed to do anything. There's a lot of questions and comments, and there's a lot to talk about. So I want to apologize in advance to everyone for not being able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. I'll just request that if you could please put your questions in the chat. That'll help me keep an eye on them. So I have a ton of questions, but first I wanna give to you, Ray, a question that is coming up in the chat. People are saying that they're kind of discrediting this idea of Russia having legitimate security concerns, and they're saying that this invasion or this military operation by Russia, it's motivated by Vladimir Putin's desire to rekindle the Russian imperial empire. Well, what would you say to that?
Well, I'd ask them for the evidence of that, of course. It's really hard. After the U.S. overthrew the government in Kiev, which was properly labeled the most blatant coup in history, since we had intercepted conversations of the coup plotters plotting it. Okay, 2.5 weeks before the coup, when Putin got back from Sochi, closing up the Winter Olympics, it was the day after the coup. It was the 23rd of February, 2014. And he got together with all his advisors and said, well, what's the most important thing we have to do? They're saying that Russian can't be an official language anymore. They're saying they want to join NATO. And the most important thing, of course, look, we have an all-weather, all-year-round naval base in Sevastopol, right there in Crimea. We have to make sure that that doesn't go to NATO. How do we do that? Well, it's an accident of history that Crimea is part of Ukraine and not part of the Russian Federation. Khrushchev, when he came in 54, right after Stalin died, he needed a lot of help, and he thought, well, he's almost Ukrainian, right on board. He got a lot of Ukrainian support by saying, hey, let's give Crimea to Ukraine. Okay, that's how it happened. You mean, how did he do that? Well, he took a piece of paper, Khrushchev, and he did an ukaz. You know what ukaz is? So let it be. Okay. So Putin said, well, I don't want to do that. Maybe we'll have a plebiscite. I mean, we know how that would go. Most of these people are Russian stock. Some 80 to 90% of people would want to join us. So they did a plebiscite. And the vote, of course, was to rejoin Russia. Now, a month after the Crimea was annexed into Russia proper, Putin got up and there was a big celebration. He said, well, month anniversary here. He said, but I have to tell you, the real reason why we had to deprive Crimea from going to NATO. He said, we were not wanting Ukraine to go into NATO, but even more important, his words, even more important was to prevent offensive strike weapons from going on the periphery of Ukraine targeted at Russia. Now, that's 2014, April 2014. So I didn't include that in my remarks, but it goes way back beyond 16 or 15, 14, right after the coup. That was the benchmark. Now, the thing that I would like to emphasize here is there's not one scintilla of evidence, not one, that had ever entered Putin's or anybody else's head. Oh, let's annex Crimea until there was a coup in Kiev. And we know who arranged the coup. So, if there were evidence before that, even if the rhetoric from the West was so bad against Putin, it wasn't. It only started when we did the coup and reacted by protecting his sole all year round naval base set there by Elizabeth the Great, not Catherine the Great, for God's sake, at the same time as our revolution. So people can argue that the Soviet Union really didn't implode, that there's this revanchist sort of thing where they really want to take over the world again, or they really want to take over the rest of Europe, or the Baltics are next, or Poland is next. all I'd say is, give me some evidence of that, please. Have you been in the Baltics? I have. Why the hell would no reflection here, but why would Russia want to take over the Baltic? I don't know. It seems to me the burden of proof is on those that say that the Soviet Union really didn't disappear. These guys still want to take over the world. There's no evidence of that. I'm sorry. I'm an evidence-based analyst.
Great, thanks, Ray. Sometimes I hear people say people who are opposed to war and peace activists, and they want peace. So sometimes I hear some of them say things like, Russia should pull out of Ukraine. Russia should leave Ukraine. And I think that sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But I'm thinking that what I'm thinking is what you described to us tonight about these missile placements around Russia and pulling out of the ABM Treaty, and about Russia's legitimate security concerns. You spoke about the events of 2014 in Ukraine when we did a coup and the US has been expanding NATO. Russia has all these legitimate security concerns. There was a negotiated Minsk Accord that the US and the West didn't follow through on. So we're like ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns. So what I'm thinking is that the obstacle to peace in Ukraine, it's not Russia, it's the US policymakers, because of the things you described in your talk and because of other things. Isn't that right?
Well, let me talk about Minsk, for example. It's not just that it didn't work out. Now, Minsk, for those of you who don't know, right after the coup in Kiev, there were hostilities. The people in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk, Russian-speaking people didn't want to exist under this coup regime. Now, I already told you that they banned Russian as an official language. That was bad enough. They were doing other things. These guys said, no, we want to be independent. So did the people in Crimea, as we know. So what happened was there was starting to be a war. And Ukrainian forces were sent out there to suppress these people, and these people reacted. The Russians gave these people some weaponry, I'm sure, and some technical advice. But when these people in Donetsk and Lugansk said to Putin, please, annex us too, please. You annex Crimea, I mean, hello, that's, you're biased there. Annex us, please. And Putin said, no. We're going to work this out, okay? Now, what happened? They got together. The main powers here that were involved, France, Britain, and Russia, and Ukraine. And they said, okay, now let's see if we do a ceasefire. They did a ceasefire. That was good. Now, how we solve this thing? We give a degree of regional autonomy to Donetsk and Lugansk. There was no provision for that in the Ukrainian constitution, so we changed the constitution. Now, guess what? That was agreed up in early 2015, Minsk II. Since then, it was all diddly-daddling. For what purpose? To arm the Ukrainian forces so they could take back Donbass by force. How do we know that? The main people involved, Angela Merkel, François Hollande, Peter Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself has said, Minsk, that was just a delaying tactic. We want to give a breathing space for the Ukrainian forces to be built up by NATO and be ready to take back the Donbass. Now, this is not McGovern saying that. This is these major people. And I think that what ticked off the Russians most about this is that there was no contrition or regret. There was boasting. Yeah, we diddled Putin. We strung him around from 2015 all the way to 2021. And look, we got a really formidable. I mean, the Ukrainian army is probably the strongest army in Europe because it was trained so well during those years. Now, Putin was under a good bit of pressure in Russia, and he conceded. He said openly, Uh, we should have struck while the iron was hot. We should not have trusted these guys. And everybody said, yeah, you're right, Vladimir. Yeah, don't trust them anymore. So that's part of the woodwork here. That's part of the backdrop. It's hard to trust folks anymore, not only for that, but for the kind of chronology that I tried to draw today, having to do with one specific aspect of this, that is medium-range ballistic missiles.
Yeah, that reminds me of what I read in Steve Cohen's book, War with Russia, that there were people in Russia, advisors to Vladimir Putin, who've been saying for years that you can't trust the U.S., you can't negotiate with them. And unfortunately, the U.S. validates that by being so treacherous in their negotiations. Ray, can you comment for us on these Pentagon leaks? Is the takeaway message here that they show that we're being lied to by our government and media about the war in Ukraine? Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think you put your finger on it, Amar. The way I look at it is that it's pretty much a distraction to try to figure out how this one airman first class got access to all this stuff. I don't think he really had access to all this stuff. A lot of this stuff, I think, has been surfaced in a deliberate attempt to show that Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland are lying through their teeth. Guess what, folks? Ukraine is not going to win. Guess what, folks? Ukraine can't win. I mean, even Obama said it. Wasn't that in one of my little last slides here? Where is it? Here, I got paper here. This is here's Obama saying, if we send arms to Ukraine, this is crazy because it would, quote, encourage the Ukrainians to think that they could actually defeat the far more important and the far more powerful Russians. So, I mean, don't do stupid stuff. So, what I'm saying here is that the question had to do with, the leaks. Okay. The importance of the leaks, in my view, is that they reflect, to me, a wish by some factions within the intelligence services, within the JCS, within even the State Department, to embarrass Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, and tell the American people, look, you've been had. Now, I looked at the titles of very key articles that appeared in the Washington Post from April 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, okay? That was when the first leaks came out. Okay, one headline, Ukraine's running out of ammunition for its for air defense. It won't have any air defense in the middle of next month. No air defense, okay? Another one, they're running out of ammunition for other things as well. Another one, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, says this is going to just go on right into next year. There's no prospect of any peace talks or anything like that. Okay, well, there were a couple of like that. The BBC did exactly the same thing. Now, what am I saying here? I'm saying that the Washington Post and the BBC don't go to the bathroom without asking the White House if it's okay. Okay, so someone gave them the go-ahead to put out this alternative story. It's not alternative truth. It happens to be the real truth. And now these people are going to have to contend with it. Even Politico, for God's sake, is saying, whoa, these guys really have a problem now because it doesn't look like the Ukrainians are going to be able to mount anything in the way of a spring counteroffensive. So what I'm saying here is that the real significance of this, in my view, so far at least, is that the American people have been given the wherewithal in mainstream media, at least for those first 5 or 6 days, to see what the real story is. And there's always a chance that with you and me and others so motivated and committed to action as well as peace, that we can turn this thing around and tell our fellow citizens, look, we're being had again. There's no alternative to stopping the blood. First aid, stop the bleeding. That's the first thing you do. You know, while all this stuff is going on, people getting killed and maimed. So it's not necessary. It's not going to be any easier to end this thing a month or two from now than it is right now. And you have all kinds. You have the Chinese, you have the Belarusians, you have the Pope, for God's sake, saying, let's have some peace negotiations. Let's have a ceasefire. Makes eminent good sense. The U.S. is very isolated on this. I don't know how much longer the U.S. will be able to resist the pressure to do the sensible thing, sit down and talk. And then later you could talk about what motivated the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But if you don't know what motivated the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you won't understand how Russia looks at its equities and how determined Russia would be to not let this kind of threat arise again.
We all want, well, so many of us, most of us want the US and Russia to sit down and talk and negotiate and do diplomacy and come to resolution on things that we have disagreements about. But again, the obstacle to that seems to be the US side and the Biden administration. When I listen to you, Ray McGovern, and I listen to people like Scott Ritter and Doug McGregor, what you guys are saying is like, it's like a polar opposite of what's coming from the Biden administration. So I'm wondering, like you talk about, yes, the Pope and everyone wants negotiations to happen, but but like, if Biden and Blinken and Victoria Nuland are the obstacles to that, then how is all of this going to end?
The Chinese used to have an expression in the old days, it will come to a no good end. It's going to come to an end. Okay, the question is this year or next year. Now, as I read the situation, and I'm helped very much by military people like Colonel McGregor, the Russians are prepared for any kind of counter-offensive that the Ukrainians are likely to be able to field, okay? Not only that, but they're able eventually to go all the way to the Dnieper River if they so desire. Now, would they go? I don't think they had intended to go in the beginning of this fracas, but as Foreign Minister Lavrov and Putin himself have said, look, it's a matter of geography now. You provide these fancy missiles that go 200 miles. We have to move up where we are 200 more miles. Pretty simple geography. Now, there is a natural geographic barrier. It sort of divides Ukraine in two, Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, the Dnieper River, okay? That would be a natural ceasefire line or DMZ, whatever you want to call it. And Putin, although nobody noticed this, nobody reads Putin's speeches or stays around for the Q&A. Putin has given a straw in the wind here, saying, Odessa. Where's Odessa? Well, Odessa is the last big port on the Black Sea that the Ukraine government still rules, okay? Now, how did this come out? Well, very briefly, during a Q&A after one of these speeches at Valdai, October it was, a very clever, seemed like a planted question, a very clever journalist said that, Mr. Putin, Mr. President, I'm planning to travel to Odessa. And I'm wondering, what would you advise? Should I apply for a Ukrainian or should I apply for a Russian visa? Pretty clever, huh? Putin says, oh, Odessa, a beautiful, beautiful city. I hope you go there. But what I'd say about Odessa is it could be a, let's see, what's the words he used? A razdora. It could be a yabloko razdora. Okay, now yabloko is apple. Okay, razdora is discord. Now hopefully some of you remember the Trojan War and how it all, you have to remember your mythology, okay? The apple of discord. It could be, yes, sir, could be an apple of discord, or it could be a way to get together, assess each other's interests, and come to resolution of very serious problems. Putin said that. Now, what do I think he means? I think in the end, he would settle for letting Odessa be part of what's left of Ukraine, so that not just a landlocked farm for the rest of Europe, so that they will have a viable country with access to the sea. But he's not willing to give up much more. But at least there's a overture as to how this could be a yabloko razdora, an apple of discord, or it could be a way to settle differences. So there are all kinds of hints like that. And either they're missed by people like Michael McFaul and Tony Blinken and Jacob Sullivan, my God, or nobody tells them about it, or they don't think that they should tell the president this to discomfort him. In any case, the leadership of our country in the foreign policy area is a disaster. And I just hope that they come to their senses before the country itself suffers disaster, because that's what's coming in Ukraine, unless these admirals in our famous Navy who talk about these little tactical nuclear weapons, we could use those, okay? Now, please understand that once tactical nuclear weapons are put into play, there's no guarantee that we will be able to avoid World War III. So what we veteran intelligence professionals for Saturday told Biden last time we wrote him in January, said, look, you can't have both, okay? You can't weaken Russia, defeat Russia, and avoid World War III. You got that? You can't have both. So my view is that we need to kind of get together and just, this happens in wars. You don't have to be best friends. You don't have to be winning or losing. You get together and you talk and you ceasefire meanwhile and stop the bleeding.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Thank you again to everyone who's here right now. Over 200 people live in the Zoom meeting and dozens watching on social media. I can tell from the chat that there's a range of views on this conflict. There's a wide range of views, and so I'm going to do my best to give Ray questions from the chat. So again, I'm going to ask everyone, please, if you could put your questions and comments in the chat, I'll try my best to keep an eye out on that. Ray, there's a question in the chat here. I'm going to read it off to you from Evelyn. Evelyn writes, Mr. McGovern, how do you explain the horrific civilian deaths and casualties of Ukrainians during this Russia-Ukraine war?
How do I explain it? Well, first, I bemoan it. I think it's awful. I think it needs to stop. That's what I think I've been saying. But it won't stop until you figure out why it happened in the first place. And maybe the easiest way is to simply refer to John Mearsheimer, who years ago said that the fracas in Ukraine is the fault of the West, okay? How does he explain that? Well, very simply, not unlike what Obama was quoted as having said by me. Look, Ukraine is a core interest to a major superpower, okay? Now, when a major superpower feels an existential threat, it's going to remove that threat. Now, does Ukraine have the right to join whatever alliance? Of course it does under international law, but Mearsheimer comes from a school of realism. It may be unfair, it may be terrible, but you have to understand that's what big powers do. And I would say that if you go back 60 years, that's exactly what we did in Cuba. So that's the real world, Okay. Now, I would say this, that when Putin invading with 170,000 troops does not betoken an aim to take over Ukraine. It was a limited invasion. It boiled down later to protecting the people in Donbass. And then as these new armaments came in from the West, as I say, geography moved it farther west. So what does that mean? Well, maybe we ought to think of, well, what were the reasons that Putin did this? How about the civilian casualties? Well, reliable reporting indicates that unlike shock and awe, what we did in Baghdad and Iraq, that the Russians have really been careful to avoid, to the extent possible, civilian casualties. They profess to be brother Slavs, and in reality they are. And so the real story, which we will not uncover in propaganda from our side, is that they have been pretty meticulous in trying to bomb and rocket launch against military targets, or more recently, targets of economic importance or military importance. So one has to be really careful what one digests from the major media in this country. The bloodshed is terrible, and why Zelensky keeps sending battalion after battalion of troops up to Bakhmut to be slaughtered by Russian artillery is something I don't understand. But the U.S. apparently is encouraging him to do that. What they should do, and actually, let's remember, the U.S. is calling the shots here. What the U.S. should do is say, cease and desist. Let's work out the best deal that we can.
We've been seeing more and more that countries are doing business and trade with each other and using currencies other than the US dollar. They're doing business with China and using the Chinese currency. A lot of people have been commenting about this, saying, calling it de-dollarization, and saying it's a result of the US weaponizing the dollar in this proxy conflict with Russia. Do you have any sort of comment on that, Ray?
On which aspect of that, MR? I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Is the U.S. Is the U.S. policies to in regards to Russia, is it self-destructive to the U.S. and Western Europe, economically and otherwise?
Well, so far it has been. I mean, the U.S. says it has isolated Russia. Well, give me a break. What you have now, and this is pernicious to the core. You have the lily white West against the rest of the world. China, 1.4 billion. India, next month, 1.5 billion. Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran, for God's sake. All of those folks are now following the lead of Russia and China. Now, it's kind of sort of obvious to somebody who looks on this dispassionately that you have 80% of the world's people of color are against what's going on in NATO. And so it's just a matter of time before NATO will have to wake up and say, well, it was great while it lasted. We were the hegemon. Hegemon, by the way, comes from the Greek word hegemon, okay? It's not only to lead, but to dominate, okay? Now, US and West European or European dominance is over. It's gone. And Putin turned to China, and they have a virtual military alliance now. And I hope that finally gets through the heads of people like Jacob Sullivan and Tony Blinken, because it's real. And let me remember where you heard this first. If there's a military dust-up between US forces and Russian forces in Ukraine or around there. There's going to be trouble in the South China Sea and or the Taiwan Strait, okay? First, it will be saber rattling, but then it will be more, because these two big powers have now joined out of the realization that not only that 2 against 1 is better, but they both face the same common enemy. And they don't have to be paranoid to say that. All they have to do is read the US strategic documents, which pretty much say China's the main enemy. We get rid of this little squirt that we call Russia, it's a gas station posing as a country, and then we go get you. So China realizes that if Putin has a setback in Ukraine, Xi Jinping is the next, okay? So it's, it doesn't make any sense. Well, let me just finish this little thing because it's really important. Putin was asked about this as well at Valdai. People need to read these things to the degree they're available. He was asked by one person, now, Mr. President, what do you make of the fact that the US is taking on China as well as taking on us in Ukraine? Does that make any sense to you, Mr. President? And he looks and he says, no, it's bereft of any logic. It doesn't make any sense. He said, it's crazy. Сумасшедший. Mind, out of mind, shedzy, walking out of your mind. It's crazy, his word, okay? And then he says, and this is really important, he says, the only thing I can figure is that it's the result of overweening arrogance and a feeling of impunity. Now, I happen to agree with his diagnosis, okay? But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what McGovern thinks. It happens to matter what Putin thinks and what Xi Jinping thinks. And if they think these guys are crazy and their military are in tenterhooks as to what they might do next, well, that's a bad situation. It rivals what I experienced during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was almost right on the scene.
Okay. Okay, there's a lot of questions in the chat. One of the previous questions about the civilian casualties in Ukraine, a lot of people in the chat, Ray, are taking issue with your answer. They're asking about, what about the hospitals being bombed? What about residential buildings being bombed? And someone also commented that they perceive this program to be an apology for Vladimir Putin.
Well, okay. Well, let me say this, that it really depends on your sources, okay? Now, if you watch and listen to the mainstream media, you are not getting the truth. I just tell you that right off the bat. So, you are hearing about all these terrible incidents. A couple of them we know to have been staged, and you're not hearing the other side of it at all. There are no reporters in the Donbass. There were no reporters to report the 14,000 Russian-speaking people who were killed between 2014 and 2022, or the 5,000 more that were killed since the invasion. So you're not getting a balanced picture. And the first casualty of war is the truth. And our mainstream media has never been very good at the truth. Now, I have to tell you that I understand these kinds of these questions. They're legitimate. But I had one former colleague whom actually I worked with on the president's daily brief work. Really smart guy, He writes to me 3 years ago in an email. He says, Ray, you've lost it. You're in Putin's pocket. We can't understand what's happened. You used to know so much about Russia. What's happened? What do your children think about what you've done? You're what's happened? And then he says, I'm glad that I have a chance to denounce you, his word, denounce you publicly, because they're not going to come after me anymore, even though we work together. Now, if this was some crazy guy, I'd write it off. But, you know, it's really strange. These were people who bought the whole 9 yards of Russiagate. It was all phony. I don't like Donald Trump. I think he was the worst president I ever lived under. But Russiagate was a phony fraud. And now we know it. We now know it, chapter and verse, but it's not revealed in the mainstream press. Did you know that CrowdStrike, the cyber firm that was supposed to look into the Russian hack, testified? Its CEO testified on December 5th, 2017. There was no hack. There was no exfiltration from the DNC computers by Russia or by anyone else. Did you know that? No, you didn't know that because it's not been in the New York Times. I had somebody say to me, well, Ray, what do you say Putin? Putin. Everybody else says Putin. What do you say? So I lost it. I said, well, you don't want to call him up. That's what he says. He says, here's Putin. Anyhow, I have no direct relationship with Putin, but I will say, and I'll say this for the record, that I think were he not to be as strong a leader of a major country, were he to be replaced by somebody more, more like Donald Trump, let's say, or even more like somebody who would be very aggressive, we would be in even more trouble than we are now. So you can call me a Putin apologist. And the last thing I'll say here is that when I was in Germany about 6 years ago or so, there was this button. I used to have it around here. It said, Putin verstehe. I looked at it. Verstehen means to understand, right? So I said, hey, Putin, somebody who understands Putin. Like, give me one. He said, no. My friend says, don't put that button on. That means you're in Putin's pocket. I said, wait a second. To verstehen, to understand somebody, puts you in Putin. Yeah, don't put on that. That's how bad it is. You try to understand these people, as I have tried to explain to you, just one facet of the dilemma in Ukraine as it appears to Russian leaders. And let me just set the record straight. I joined the CIA 60 years ago. This month, just April? Yeah, April 1963. I've been focused on Russian leaders from Khrushchev right down to Putin. I think I know a little bit about how they think. And my expertise in Russian studies goes back yet another 5 years. So, you can call me whatever you want. I'm not an apologist. I'm somebody who looks at these things, reads stuff that's suppressed in Western media, and then talks to the experts like Bill Binney on the Russian hack and Ted Postal on strategic matters like the intermediate nuclear forces.
Thanks, Ray. And what you just said was totally consistent with everything I read in Steve Cohen's book, War with Russia. Who's also a very qualified Russia expert, very experienced Russia expert. He also said that actually Vladimir Putin is very restrained in the face of constant U.S. provocation, U.S. arrogance, that actually we're lucky that Vladimir Putin has shown so much restraint over so many years because another leader might not have. I want to take a moment to pivot away for a slightly different question, just for one question, because there's over 200 people watching, and I know they'll be interested in this topic. Ray, what's the book behind you on your bookshelf with John Kennedy? Why do you have it featured so prominently on your bookshelf?
Oh, that happened by accident. But now that you mention it, I keep it there all the time. It's James Douglas's study. It's about 17, 18 years old now. JFK and the Unspeakable. Douglas he's a Catholic worker, for God's sake. He runs a Catholic worker house in Birmingham, Alabama, but he's also an incredible researcher. This is the best book out on the JFK assassination. Do I believe that the CIA was involved in assassinating JFK? I do. Do I have good reason to believe that? I do. And it's not only reading books, it's some personal experiences I had at the CIA as a trainee way back before John Kennedy was killed. So yeah, let me advertise this. If you're interested in this, and if you've sold a bill of goods that, I don't know, this is a conspiracy theory, let me just say this, that after the assassination, LBJ took it into his head to appoint a very, very safe Warren Commission. And the way he did that was to appoint Alan Dulles to be the chief staff guy. Well, actually, he was a member of the commission. Now, who's Alan Dulles? He was the Bay of Pigs guy. He was the guy that flicked off John Kennedy as a newcomer and arranged the Bay of Pigs and all that kind of stuff. Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA, and John Kennedy cashiered him. Now, you don't cashier a patrician, well-heeled, incredibly well-connected. His brother was Secretary of State, for God's sake. Anyhow, what happened was a long story, right? But what I'm trying to say here is that, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I remember Donald Trump getting up and saying to the media, today is the day that by congressional law, I am compelled to release the rest of the CIA and FBI documents on the Kennedy assassination. That was 10 o'clock in the morning. 2:30 in the afternoon, President gets up before the microphone. I changed my mind. This is Trump. This is almost verbatim. I have talked to the CIA and to the FBI, and they told me they can't really declassify the rest of those documents. So I've decided to postpone it for 6 months. So McGovern is watching this, right? So he makes a little note in his calendar, 6 months, you know. What happened after 6 months? Zero. Nothing. Did any journalist raise it? No. Did McGovern? I didn't have a chance to raise it. Okay. So what's going on? Well, Biden is sitting on the same documents. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a really even intelligent analyst to figure out something stinks here, right? Why are they so reluctant? How many years after the assassination to release those documents? Well, I think it's a no-brainer why. They were involved. And Alan Dulles was able to set up the witnesses and the testimony and all that stuff on the Warren Commission to have this legend out there as to how it actually happened. And this is important, okay? Listen. When people objected, I mean, some people thought maybe the CIA had something to do with it. After all, the President Kennedy had been quoted as saying he thinks the CIA should be blown apart into 5,000 pieces and scattered into the ocean or something like that. I mean, he had a real animus against the CIA since they had tried to mousetrap him on the Bay of Pigs. So anyhow, people were saying, well, wait a second, Alan Dulles pretty much running the Warren Commission? I mean, we think maybe he was involved in that thing. Guess what Alan Dulles said? Conspiracy theorists. You guys are a bunch of conspiracy theorists. It's stuck. And it exists today. And that's where it really got its pizzazz. So if you want to be called a conspiracy theorist, join me in thinking that John Kennedy was done in by not only the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was pulling out of Vietnam, for God's sake. He was giving the world up to the communists. He wanted to get along with the communists, for God's sake. So, it's a really sad story. And James Douglas has the first 100 pages explaining the real raison d'etre for what he was trying to do with Khrushchev and how that all fell apart after he was killed.
Thanks, Ray. I was last week in Boston. I was at Robert Kennedy Jr.'s presidential announcement in Boston, and I actually saw a lot of friends there from Mass Peace Action and from Community Church of Boston. And RFK told the story about how JFK realized he was being betrayed by the CIA, and his quote that he's going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the wind. And when RFK Jr. said that, that was the loudest applause of his whole speech. It was remarkable. So that was very interesting. Then someone pulled the fire alarm during his speech. They tried to evacuate the building, and it was fake though. RFK Jr. said, "Nice try." Okay. All right. So we're going to take a few more questions before we wrap up for tonight. Ray, there's a question in the chat where actually, I'll take another question from the chat. There's a few people asking. A lot of people are asking, what can we do? What can we do as citizens? And more about the path to peace in Ukraine. They want to hear more about peace. How is the war going to end, and what can they do to support peace?
Well, I would refer once again to the revelations about Ukraine not being able to win. I mean, isn't that what Obama said way back when? And the situation, the way it is, rather than how we've been led to think about it. And once people get it into their heads that Putin and the Russians see an existential threat here, do we see it the same way? Well, I don't think so. I don't think we should. Certainly Obama didn't. Then why can't we just kind of get together and say, well, tell us more about how you feel, Putin, and how we can allay whatever concerns you still have. Maybe, okay, we're not going to have any offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. That's clear now. You're taking care of that. Do we have to get rid of them ones in Romania and Poland? Well, maybe we could have on-site inspectors there to make sure that they're not offensive. So there are ways to work these things out, for God's sake. And the cardinal example of all this is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty itself. Now, for those who don't remember, that destroyed a whole class of intermediate and medium-range ballistic missiles already in place, SS-20s in the Soviet Union, Pershing IIs in Western Europe. They were there. They were ready to fire. The problem was this very reduced time launched to target. And Gorbachev said to Ronald Reagan, look, we don't need this. We already have deterrence from the ICBMs. Let's destroy all these things. Now, when I first heard about that, I said, right. Destroy a whole class of nuclear weapons. And I was on duty then. I was briefing down at the White House. I never thought it would happen. Gorbachev said, look, we can do it if we do a good inspection regime. Doveraj, no proveraj. Was it trust but verify? And that's exactly what happened. Scott Ritter has a wonderful book on this, for God's sake. You ought to read it. The challenges they faced. There are not a lot of people in Washington in favor of this thing working, but it did. Now, if we can do that, for God's sake, we can fix this Ukraine problem by giving everybody his or her due and by working out things so the bleeding stops.
Okay, there's a question in the chat about any sort of resources, films, books, other resources that you might recommend specifically about? Hold on, let me pull up the question. I just had it. Can you recommend any documentaries or educational links that give a good overview of the history leading up to the U.S. empire's proxy war in Ukraine? And I just want to say real quickly that a couple of weeks ago, we screened Oliver Stone's film, Ukraine on Fire. Had a really great turnout. So that's a good film I'd recommend. Do you have anything you'd add to that, Ray?
You know, there are a lot of good things out there. The question is to make sure you find them. There are websites like antiwar.com, like consortiumnews.com. The Gray Zone is a wonderful, wonderful website. And I have to tell you now that hits my mind here that my son, who runs my website and created it, I get in real trouble with him if I don't mention our website, okay? He says, Dad, for God's sake, mention it's raymcgovern.com. It's not hard to remember. And then, and Dad, then say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. But I'm far too modest and humble to say that part. But I will mention raymcgovern.com. I also have a Twitter at Ray McGovern. Now, I put other people's stuff on there as well. And just out of curiosity, I'll mention that for the last several weeks, I've been a weekly Monday guest on Judging Freedom, Judge Napolitano. He gives me a half hour sometimes to answer his questions and so forth. So if you like my approach to things, or if you want to get even more angry because you think I'm in Putin's pocket, Judge Napolitano on Mondays would be a good place to go. Let's see. I used to recommend Amy Goodman. I suffice it to say, I no longer do. Aaron Mattei, who used to work with Amy, is now with the Gray Zone. He's a terrific guy. So the Gray Zone, Consortium News, antiwar.com, raymcgovern.com. You get to know, just by visiting these places, you get to know other things that are out there. And I should add that I've done several lectures like this, even here, I think, at Massachusetts Peace Action and at the church. Some of them actually a little primer on how we got into Ukraine, and they go back 2 or 3 years. So if you search my website, which again, my son says, tell him it's really easily searchable. Remember that whole week I put in making it easily searchable? So you could find things that way as well. YouTube, of course, is another way to do it.
And I just shared the link for raymcgovern.com in the chat, so people could check that out. Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll take 2 more questions and then give Ray the floor for any final remarks for tonight. One question in the chat someone was asking, Ray, was, can you, when people say that people in Crimea wanted to be a part of Russia, people in the Donbass want to be a part of Russia, someone in the chat was questioning how legitimate is that?
Mm-hmm. Very. Now, a rudimentary knowledge of Crimea, how it existed, how it was cultivated, how it was willy-nilly given to the Ukrainian SSR by Khrushchev for political reasons. See, it didn't matter then. It was all part of the USSR, for God's sake. All of a sudden, it came to matter. But the ethnicity and the whole, the experience of World War II in Sevastopol down there, I've been there in Crimea, Yalta. Those are really important places, and the Donbass is also pretty much self-explanatory. If you look at the history in any credible history book, except ones written by Timothy Snyder of Yale, will kind of clue you in.
Okay. Someone, Ray, in the chat was inviting you. There's a JFK peace group, and on June 10th, they're going to hold a screening of John Kennedy's speech at American University, where he announced that they're going to unilaterally stop testing nuclear bombs, I think. And that led to nuclear test ban treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. So it's a remarkable speech. They're going to screen it on June 10th in an event like this. And Jeff Sachs will be joining us to talk about John Kennedy and making peace with Russia. So Ray, someone's inviting you to that. If you're free June 10th, they would love to have you there at 7 p.m. for the John Kennedy screening with Jeff Sachs.
Where would this be?
It's online. It's on Zoom like this.
Oh, good. Yeah, sure. I can. I'm a little limited here because I'm a care provider for my wife, and I don't get out of Raleigh, North Carolina very much. But Zoom, I can do. By the way, the first 100 pages of James Douglas's book on JFK and the unspeakable is devoted in one way or another to that American University speech, which was a classic, and it's just a tragedy that those kinds of ideas have disappeared.
Right. Okay. So I want to ask, I'll ask one last question and then we'll get ready to wrap up the program. Ray, I'm curious because you have a very interesting experience at the CIA and doing the President's Daily Brief. I'm wondering if you could talk about that. When you did the President's Daily Brief, were you also briefing George H.W. Bush? And also, wasn't he the head of the CIA at one point? Did you know George Bush Sr. From the CIA?
I did. Yeah, I worked directly under him when he was CIA director. It was less than a year, 74, 75, something like that. So I knew him then. And then when he became vice president, I was one of we had a team of 2 briefers to go down early in the morning around 7 o'clock to brief Vice President Bush, Secretary of State Schultz, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, the assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. That was any one of 4 people who, a couple of them ended up in jail. And later we said to the president, look, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff should be given this same one-on-one treatment, and he approved that. So on any given morning, my colleague and I would cover 3 or 4, maybe, well, it was usually 2 or 3 of the people who were in town. Now, what about the president? Well, it's a really interesting story. We insinuated ourselves with the President's Daily Brief to Ronald Reagan as soon as he became president-elect. 2 of my buddies, a little more senior than I, went out to Pacific Palisades or wherever it was, and 7 o'clock in the morning, they showed up at the Reagan household and said to the Secret Service, CIA briefers. And they said, we don't have any word about this. What would see? Look, we have the President's Daily Brief here. And all of a sudden, Ronald Reagan comes down in his bathrobe. What's going on here? CIA briefer, sir, morning briefer. Oh, come on in. We were in. He loved it. Every morning, there were 2 very senior analysts that did it. Did a terrific job. He loved it, okay? Now, George Bush, of course, learned about this. So when they got to Washington, after the inauguration, George H.W. Bush goes to President Reagan. He says, I'd really like to get the same treatment, the one-on-one from these seasoned senior briefers. Would that be okay? And I think probably Secretary of State, and Reagan says, of course. So Bush says, well, now, what time would you like to, you want to get it first? And Reagan says, I think it'd really be good if you all got briefed as early as you want. And then why don't you come see me about 11:30 and tell me what I should be thinking now that we're here. So what I'm saying here, I'm saying that we seldom saw the president. What we did see were the people who would be briefing him at 11:30. Okay. That was big because each of them knew that each of the others were getting the same substantive information. It was heady. It was really important work, okay? And it was a real good example of how the intelligence cycle works at its best, because we went to deliver the finished product, okay? And that in turn drove the requirements. We have this question, we have that question. Well, how about this? That drove we went back to headquarters and we said, they need to know this. The collection devices, such as they were, whether up there or human agents, are tasked, okay? It could be that the next day we have the answer. Usually it'd take a week or so, depending on what the problem was. But you have collection, analysis, dissemination, the whole circle at the highest level. It was incredible. The only thing that I had to contend with was that my bosses thought that Mikhail Gorbachev was just a clever commie, and that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would never, ever, ever give up power peacefully. That was Bobby Gates and Bill Casey. So McGovern, who was known to George Shultz as a Soviet expert in his own right, was able to tread that fine line when Shultz would say to me, now, I suppose your superiors would say, I shouldn't go to talk to Gorbachev. I would say, well, sir, as you know, I don't always agree with what my superiors think on these issues. And he would know exactly what I was thinking. Now, it wasn't just me. I could depend on a whole group of analysts analyzing open sources, okay? It was called the analysis group of the Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service, FBIS, started right after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, evaluating, keeping track of Japanese propaganda, an incredibly lucrative discipline. And I knew these guys like the palm of my hand. I fed off them. They had such expertise, it wouldn't quit, and they always told the truth. So it wasn't McGovern going down to Shultz. It was McGovern checking with these guys who are honest, who are not working directly under Bobby Gates or Bill Casey, and gave him, and the deal, of course, was, look, Mr. Shultz, Gorbachev is the real deal. Things are appearing on the front page of Pravda that have never been seen on the front page of Pravda before. This is real. He seems to be interested in things like intermediate nuclear forces agreements. So that's what my friends think. And sotto voce, Bobby Gates and Bill Casey, I will always find 5 Russians under every rock, whether it be Nicaragua or Madagascar.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Okay, I'm sorry that there's so many questions and comments I didn't get a chance to get to.
I can hang around if you like. I mean, as long as I have cough drops.
Well, there's one question here from Catherine. Catherine wrote, quote, why is no one talking about the fascists that are in such number, both in the Ukraine government and also the Ukrainian military? By supporting the Ukrainian government, aren't we helping fascist and Nazi powers build power in Europe?
Well, the answer to the last one is yes. The answer to the first one is nobody's talking about that anymore, because 4 years ago, the New York Times was told not to mention that anymore. I mean, look at it. The New York Times were reporting on this, showing the swastikas, showing these guys, I mean, all of a sudden, now they become our friends. And, with John McCain and those guys falling in with Tony Hook and all those far-right people, even Victoria Nuland told the ambassador there in that intercepted conversation, look, keep the real Nazis off. She didn't say Nazis. You keep Sloboda and the others off. Let Yatsenyuk. He's a clean guy. Let him be the guy. So it's really a mark of our major media that Nazis became denazified all of a sudden because we didn't want to embarrass the Ukrainian government. Now, Zelensky himself can't do much that will put him at loggerheads with these proto-Nazis, neo-Nazis. The Russians are now calling them Nazis right off the bat. So it's a real problem. And, you know, you don't have to know a whole lot about World War II history to know that the people these people worship, Stepan Bandera and others, they cooperated with the SS. I mean, they murdered thousands of Poles and Hungarians, some Ukrainian Jews, Russians, and yet they're building monuments and renaming streets for them these days. So, yeah, it's a mark of how the press has prevented us from really learning the real story here. And there's got to be ways that we can figure that out. And again, peace action has to be at least half action as it is yearning for peace.
Great. Okay. Well, Ray, thank you so much for being generous with your time. Two people have their hands raised. If you have time to take their questions,
sure.
We can take a question from Bruce, and then we'll take a question from Quanta, and then wrap up tonight's program. So, Bruce, if you want to hold on, let me see if yeah, Bruce, if you want to unmute yourself and share your question or comment.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay, good. So if you will go way back in the chat to 5 o'clock, I wrote a question there at 5 o'clock. And my thought is that really the most important issue is the Paris Agreement and trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And if you really think carefully about global warming, it's from the CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions we emit. So President Biden really could tell President Putin, you need to withdraw your soldiers from the Ukraine, and we'll withdraw our soldiers, and we will all talk about the lifestyles we can pursue and not emit greenhouse gases. And that lifestyle really is to be a hunter-gatherer like Jesus recommended. Jesus said, lay not your treasures up on earth where they'll rot or where people will want to steal them. But if I'm too radical and wrong, tell me a lifestyle you can lead and not emit CO2 and greenhouse gases. So we really need to think about educating people, maybe with an artificial intelligence friend like Ellie, who can have these discussions with each person individually and let them know that, we're very grateful for your CO2 emissions up to 1850 when we ended the Little Ice Age, but now your CO2 emissions are causing global warming, and they're really destructive to Mother Earth. So we all need to put the health of Mother Earth above our own health. Do you see that as a possibility?
I see that as a imperative. Thanks, Bruce, for raising it. I don't know what goes through these people's heads. You can look at Ukraine as the mother of all opportunity costs. Think of it. Billions and billions and billions of dollars that could be devoted to challenging this problem that threatens our entire existence. Now, my wife and I have 5 children and 10 grandchildren. We care about whether they'll have a decent place where they can have clean air to breathe, where they can live a decent existence. But Ukraine is diverting attention from this transcendently important question And you know what? I had some hope that some people in high reaches would realize this. And sure enough, April Haynes, who is now Director of National Intelligence, in her first briefing of the Congress, she said, look, the transcendent problem here is global warming. It's a national security problem as well. That's why I can talk about it. And she says, how what we need to do here is recall that no one nation can do anything alone. We have to collaborate to handle this incredibly important problem. So she had her heads on right. She put that right on the front of this thing. And then you go back to the threat. I favor where the Chinese position is in all this. She said, look, here's as I understand it, look, can't we just get along? We have core interests. But can't we just how about a win-win? There's a finite amount of natural resources in the world. We know that some of them are running out. We know that we're polluting. Why can't we just all get together and figure out that no one has to be the hegemon anymore? Let's do a win-win. Well, what does China get back?
Common security. There has to be common security.
Yeah.
And no one is secure unless everyone is secure.
That's right. And what does Biden say?
Palmer said years ago.
Joan, can we let Ray speak? You'll get your turn after next. Yeah.
Okay.
No, what was I going to say? Biden's first big speech, a couple of months after he took office, China aspires not to be only the most important and powerful economic entity, but strategic entity and military. That's not going to happen on my watch. Well, that's sort of adolescent, isn't it? Juvenile, maybe, It's inevitable, Joe. Who's telling you that you can prevent China from reaching its destiny, especially with the relatively enlightened leadership that they have had over the last few decades, where they've drawn 800 million people out of poverty? Okay, why can't you just kind of listen, talk, and let live? Okay. Now that requires a metanoia, the Greek word for nous, mind. Okay, meta. You got to turn your mind all inside out so you understand. Look, we don't have to compete with each other this way. We can share. Okay, and our tradition, I have to remind you, goes back to the end of World War II, when George Kennan, who used to be my hero for his knowledge of the Soviet Union, said in the first State Department policy planning document, quote, "We have dominion over 50% of the world's resources, but we only comprise 6.9% of the world's population. Therefore, ergo, we have to do everything we can to maintain this disproportion. We can't be sidetracked by ideological things like human rights and other things of those soft nature. It will come to the exercise of hard power." Okay, so there it is. We're exceptional. We're indispensable. We have more than our share of the world's wealth. Our policies have to be devised in such a way as to maintain this equilibrium. His words, okay? That was 1947. It worked. It worked after the war for several decades. It ain't working anymore. And the sooner that these adolescents in the White House get it through their heads that doesn't work anymore, the better for all of us, especially Americans, because the day where we could work our will abroad is gone. And there are lots of people who don't wish us well, and they could easily exploit that if we're not careful.
Okay, there's lots of hands raised, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but if we can keep our questions and comments short, then we might be able to try. So next up, we're going to go to Quanta. Quanta.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everything that you said. I'm going to make it very short. In this, right now here, there were 203 people, and we have about 130 now. And most of us are from maybe peace activists from the 60s and 70s, which I am also. So what can we do by using the military-industrial complex speech by Eisenhower, his speech by from John F. Kennedy, and make a connection for them to get involved. All these people in here can encourage their children, their grandchildren, and maybe even great-grandchildren to get involved in peace movement as it was in 1960s and 70s. And they have a lot more opportunities and gadgets in their hands to get together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Quanta. Let me try to be brief here. Military-industrial complex, Eisenhower. He warned about their accretion of power, wanted or not wanted. We know it's wanted now, right? But the big thing he said was this: there's only one antidote to the growth of this power, and that is a well-informed citizenry. We ain't got that now, okay? That's up to us. I mean, yeah, with all the technology that's available to us, I fear that the fault may not be in our stars, but in ourselves. Maybe people as old as me, can be written off in terms of figuring out imaginative ways to do this. But my God, there's so much talent out there and so much goodwill that they get together and figure out a way to get this word out to fellow Americans, because the challenges are there. One good tactic that is being used by young people, Jose Vega, I saw he was on this chat. If you're still around, Jose, you might want to intervene. That's what it's called, intervention. Like when you have somebody who's an alcoholic, you have an intervention. Well, a lot of these Congress people are alcoholics, or they have the same kind of disease. And what you have to do is intervene. That means you go to these meetings and you challenge them openly. If you get thrown out, well, all right, you get thrown out. But you challenge them and you say, look, why are you doing this? Why are you giving still more aid so that the Saudis can decimate the Yemenis? That's finally coming to an aid, but not due to us. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why are you sending $100 billion to Ukraine when we can't even pay our teachers a decent wage? These kinds of things. Talk about opportunity costs, for God's sake. We can do it. It just requires a little bit of fortitude. And for those of you who have not heard me say this before, people who have this color hair, okay, white hair or gray hair, got a big advantage. Why is that? Well, most Americans don't like to see old people beat up. Okay. Now, I know from personal experience that there's a certain special sympathy for people who get beat up if they're of a certain age. The young people, they got to come into them. Old people, so what I'm beseeching you is, you have this advantage. Put it into play. They're not going to kill you. They might put you in jail. You learn a lot in jail. St. Paul was the first one to tell me about that. You learn one hell of a lot in jail, especially by talking to other people. So do it. Get out there and get off your tail. Even if you're as old as I am, you can still do it. Do it.
Great. And speaking of young people and old people, as one of the youngest people on this call, I'm going to have to be a responsible adult in a few minutes and get ready to wrap up the program. So we'll take a few more. Let's go next to Joan.
This has just been wonderful. I know so many people that agree with your position, and they are demonized as being Russian operatives. And this is the evidence that they need. And the people I know who are interested in Russia's, not Russia's side, they want to find out why, what is behind it, why there's such, as I mentioned just before, very rudely interrupt, I was thinking of Olive Palmer's statement at the UN that no country is secure unless all countries are secure. And this is the way, and yeah, that's why he talked about common security. And this is, as you were mentioning, there have been several agreements that the US has reneged on. And when I was at the UN, I met Sergei Lavrov, and he told me, I asked him, why did you why did you not veto the resolution to go into Iraq? And he said, well, I was assured by Bush, he swore that he would not use, there will be serious consequences to justify the invasion. And that's exactly what they did. And then there was the Paris Agreement of Security. Then there was the Minsk. And the US has been reneging on these, and there's got to be trust. Is a point that you were making. And I just hope that finally Biden will listen and stop this folly. He's just pushing it. And I'm from Canada, and Canada is the same way. We're suffering in so many other ways in Canada. And as you pointed out, climate change is the major issue, and getting rid of nuclear weapons. But what are we doing? You know, Canada is sending far more troops in that they can afford, and it's terrible. And I'm so appreciative of your talk. So thank you so much.
Well, you're most welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm going to. People are asking for the recording. The recording is available on YouTube. So if you search Community Church of Boston or Mass Peace Action YouTube channel, this video is up there. And I can actually send a follow-up email to everyone maybe tomorrow with links. Okay, I think we should. I think we should get ready to wrap up the program. It's been over 2 hours. Ray, you have a cold. We should let you rest. You've been speaking for a while. So I want to say thank you to everyone for spending your time with us. Over 2.5 hours almost now. A lot of interest. Thank you so much. To everyone who thinks that this was apology for Vladimir Putin apologism, I want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. And to everyone else, I also want to say thank you again for listening. So I'm not going to take up much more time. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with links to raymcgovern.com, links to this program, maybe other links they might find helpful. And to close off tonight, Ray, I want to give you the last words. Are there any final things you want to leave us with for tonight?
Spasibo, Ray.
Well, you know, I would just recall that Dr. King famously said, there is such a thing as too late. Not to be melodramatic here, but I've been around a while, and I have the sense that it's getting really close to being too late. And I think the first job that we face is to make sure we have a well-enlightened, well-educated populace, the kind of thing that Eisenhower said was the only antidote to the military-industrial complex. I think we have to kind of, we have to sort of, I like to quote Dr. King, and maybe I'll just end with that. In all the courses I've taught, I always include his letter from the Birmingham City Jail. It's a classic of American literature. It's more than that. There's one little paragraph there that sort of I cite as my morning star, something that leads me to keep doing what I've been doing now for a couple of decades. he says this about justice. See if I can remember it. He says, like a boil that can never be cured unless it's opened up with all its pus flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so too injustice must be disclosed with all the friction its disclosure creates to the air of human conscience and the light of national opinion before it can be cured. We've got a big boil now. We need to lance it, let it flow, let it heal, and get the truth out. Because for every injustice, well, there's less peace. And I just close with that notion that if we want peace, we need justice, because justice is the precondition for peace. Peace in the biblical sense is simply the existence of justice. So let's keep it up, guys. Let's not be daunted here. The foes are out there, but as Fannie Lou Hamer used to say, you know, if I fall, well, the struggle for justice will be 4'6" a little farther along. If I fall, it'll be 5'11", 5'11" forward. You all can fall forward. Let's do it. And thanks again for your attention. It's really a treat for me to be able to talk this long, not only because I'm Irish, because I do think that I have some stuff to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ray. You have stuff to say, and we have ears to listen. We're very interested to listen. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement in the chat tonight and your engagement with the program. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.